Marc Despain seemed to have it all. A devoted wife by his side for 15 years, 3 beautiful children, a booming business, a life many would envy. But when Marc was discovered lifeless on his own kitchen floor, the illusion of a perfect life shattered into a chilling mystery. His death left behind a grieving family, stunned friends, and a small town demanding answers. As police peeled back the layers of Marc's seemingly ideal life, they uncovered a tangled web of secrets, betrayals, and hidden motives. Proof that not everything is as it appears. The investigation would reveal shocking twists, multiple suspects, and a dark force that turned love and loyalty into tragedy. Welcome to True Crimes by Dominic, where we unravel the most gripping cases one layer at a time. If you're drawn to stories of crime, deception, and justice, make sure to subscribe. It's completely free and keeps you updated on our latest documentaries. Marc Despain was born on April 16, 1977, in Jonesboro, Arkansas. The Despain family ran a successful real estate business, allowing them to live comfortably. Marc grew up surrounded by love, a kind-hearted son, a protective brother, and a friend everyone wanted to have. He was the kind of guy who could light up a room with his easygoing nature and infectious laughter. From a young age, Marc had a passion for sports, especially football and baseball. At Nettleton High School, he played on the football team, earning the respect of both his coach and teammates. His love for the game followed him into adulthood, where he became a die-hard fan of the Valley View Blazers, never missing a game. But there was one love that trumped all others, Michelle. They met in high school, and from the moment Marc laid eyes on her, he knew she was the one. Despite their young age, the two became inseparable. By 1996, they were married. Marc was just 19, and Michelle only 18. Along with Michelle came her daughter Brooke, whom Marc embraced as his own, a testament to the kind of man he was. Marc's life revolved around family, faith, and building a future alongside his father in the family business. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, dark currents were stirring, currents that would ultimately drag Marc into a nightmare no one saw coming. Marc also got onto his feet very quickly and began working in the Despain family real estate business. Marc wanted to provide for his family, and he worked very hard to give Michelle and Brooke everything they wanted. So much so that years later, Marc left his family business and started his own company. He was a property investor and a real estate appraiser. Now, starting a business is very hard, and I'm sure you can imagine that not every business starts up quickly. But Marc was determined, hard-working, and relentless. Within no time, Marc's business was taking flight, and he was able to move his family out of the mobile home his parents had purchased and into a very beautiful house. Together, the couple welcomed 2 more children, boys named Zach and Blake, and the family of 5 lived very comfortably, if not lavishly. To give you an idea about how much income Marc was bringing in from his business, the family would take annual vacations to Cancun and Jamaica. They had expensive cars, and they were living their best lives. Marc's family had everything they could ever want. It is so amazing to see Marc build his business from the ground up and make his and his family's dreams come true. Michelle also worked with Marc and helped him out in the bookkeeping department. Since it wasn't that much of a hectic job, Michelle also took up a job at the local bank to stay busy. So, by all accounts, Marc, Michelle, and their 3 kids were living the life of their dreams. They had a very loving and close relationship. They were doing well financially. I mean, nothing could go wrong, right? Well, all was well until August 2011 rolled around, and suddenly things would never be the same. August 24th, 2011 was an ordinary Wednesday, until it wasn't. Michelle was working at the bank, and Marc was in his office. Now, since Marc was the boss, he could go in and out of work to settle things at home without much issue. So, at around 1 p.m., Michelle texted Marc to have lunch with him near her workplace. CCTV footage showed Marc and Michelle at a local restaurant having dinner, and they even went to go get ice cream after. Michelle went back to work, and Marc had to get something from home, so he went to their house in a quiet and peaceful neighborhood of Jonesboro, Arkansas. Around 3 p.m., Michelle asked to step out of work for a bit because she had to go back home and pick up some bills that were due to be paid that day. So Michelle drove to the family home but immediately noticed something weird. The front door of the house was unlocked. This caused fear to wedge its way into Michelle's mind, but she went inside regardless. Michelle thought that maybe Marc was doing some work outside and was going in and out of the house and left the door unlocked. But as soon as she stepped foot into the home, everything was a mess. Drawers were open and dumped out, clothes were tossed across the place. It didn't take a genius to realize that the Despain home was ransacked. She went from room to room, calling out Marc's name, and as soon as she made her way into the kitchen, she made a terrifying discovery. 34-year-old Marc Despain was on the floor, motionless and cold. Michelle tried to shake her husband, calling out his name, but he was not responding. An open ice cream container was placed on the countertop. It looked like Marc was going about his business in the kitchen and was in the middle of grabbing something to eat when he was tragically attacked. Michelle immediately got up and fled the house, calling 911 on her phone. A distressed Michelle told the operator that her husband was murdered and that she was afraid that the assailant was still inside the house, which was why she ran out. Minutes later, police and emergency services swarmed the Despain home, and the scene was taped off. As soon as the investigators stepped into the kitchen, what their eyes saw was horrific, to say the least. Marc had been attacked with a firearm at close range, and it was clear that he instantly lost his life. But something else stood out to the detectives like a sore thumb. Even though the place looked like it had been trashed, nothing valuable was taken. Money, jewelry, electronics, and even credit and debit cards were still where they were. So, the investigators had this very haunting inkling. Someone had intentionally attacked Marc and purposely made it look like a robbery gone wrong. But who had done it? Was it a problem at work that escalated to murder? Was it someone random? The police had a lot of questions, but no leads or answers. Marc's body was immediately taken away, and the rest of his family was notified of what had happened. When Jack and Tana, Marc's parents, heard of Marc's passing, they were blindsided. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Their son, who was doing so well in life, was now gone. It's something that every parent dreads hearing, but for Marc's parents, this was their worst nightmare coming to life. To find the person behind Marc's fatal attack, the investigators asked a lot of people around, including neighbors, any potential witnesses, and even Michelle, Marc's widow. She was called in for routine questioning for the detectives to understand what Marc was up to that day. Michelle told them everything, about the lunch date, how she went home to get the bills, and how she discovered a scene that turned her world upside down. When the investigators asked about anyone who would want Marc gone, Michelle had beans to spill about one person. That person was Marc's father, Jack. This revelation left the police completely confused. Was Jack really the one who had animosity towards Marc, his own flesh and blood? When the investigators asked why Michelle thought that, she went on to say that Marc left the family business because of a very heated argument between him and his dad, Jack. According to Michelle, Marc wanted a larger share of the profits from the business, but Jack wasn't on the same page. Michelle told the detectives that Jack was very greedy and didn't want to give Marc his fair share. Money is always a motive for doing the unthinkable. So, did it cloud the vision of a father and lead him to end his son's life? Well, the investigators needed more information, and that was when Michelle's dad, Carl Kelly, who actually worked as a rent collector in Marc's company, also corroborated his daughter's suspicions. On top of this, Michelle also disclosed a very disturbing event that made Jack even more suspicious in the police's eyes. See, Michelle had supposedly found inappropriate photos of her teenage daughter, Brooke, on Jack's phone. Michelle thought that Jack was a child predator, and this also led to a very serious strain between Jack and Tana's marriage. I mean, can you imagine finding very inappropriate photos of a child on your spouse's phone? It can put any relationship in hot waters. Well, the police had enough information to question Jack about his potential involvement in Marc's passing. Could it be that Marc found out about his father's disturbing behavior, and Jack didn't want to get in trouble? Well, when the investigators questioned Jack, they were left even more confused than ever. First of all, Jack denied having any involvement in Marc's attack. and even though he was not very emotional during the questioning, he would repeatedly break down in tears when he got struck with the realization that his son was no more. When the detectives asked Jack about Brooke's photos on his phone, that was when he gave the investigators information that Michelle had conveniently left out. See, Brooke was in a relationship with a boy at the time the photos were taken, and they were the ones exchanging explicit photos on an adult chatting app. Jack was the one who found Brooke using this app, and in a moment of fear and panic, Brooke accused Jack of having her photos on his phone. But no child abuse charges were ever filed against Jack. It seemed that Michelle either didn't understand the whole story or simply believed her daughter over her father-in-law, which is perfectly reasonable. As the investigators checked Jack's alibi, he was cleared as a suspect. But when the detectives asked Jack about Marc's attack, that was when he gave some very incriminating information. Jack and Tana were certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the person behind Marc's attack was none other than his own wife, Michelle. Mourning widow or black widow. At this point, Marc's case was leaving the investigators' minds boggled with all of the unexpected twists and finger-pointing. But that was until Jack and Tana shared some very interesting things about Michelle and her own greed for more. More money, more lavishness, more everything. According to Jack and Tana, Michelle was never content with how much money they had. Marc worked day and night to provide for his family, but it seemed like it wasn't enough for Michelle. She simply wanted more. Also, remember the argument Jack and Marc had that led to Marc walking out of the family business and starting his own company? Well, the initiator of the argument was not Marc or Jack, but Michelle. She coerced Marc to ask for more shares, and that led to a very heated altercation. According to Tana, Marc was the moneymaker and Michelle was the money spender. She was the brains behind those fancy vacations, luxury cars, and the finer things in life. But even that wasn't enough for Michelle. Marc was doing everything he could to support Michelle's extravagant lifestyle, but Michelle was never happy. Jack and Tana firmly believed that Michelle was a greedy woman who just cared about money. On the outside, the couple was living very lavishly, but on the inside, things were falling apart. Marc and Michelle were over their heads in debt, $2 million to be exact. Michelle was even taking out money from Marc's official business bank account without his knowledge. They weren't making nearly enough to support their extravagant lifestyle, and this was causing a lot of problems for Michelle, leading her to essentially steal money from her unsuspecting husband. If that wasn't enough, Michelle was also unfaithful to Marc. She was having an affair with a young 24-year-old co-worker. What was even more baffling was that Michelle financially supported this man. I'm talking rent, groceries, utilities, everything. All of this was new information for the police, but this next bit was truly what convinced the investigators that there was something for Michelle to gain if Marc passed away. See, Marc had 2 life insurance policies in his name, and if he were to pass away, Michelle would get a whopping $1 million. Now that Marc was no more, Michelle could easily get her hands on that insurance policy money. But even though the motive was clear as day for the police, they still didn't have concrete evidence against her. Well, that wasn't for too long, because the police went around asking Marc and Michelle's neighbors if they had seen anything suspicious on the day of the attack. Well, a couple of neighbors and witnesses saw a suspicious man in the area before Marc's attack. He was seen emerging from a blue Mercedes while someone else was driving the car. Well, even though it was not exactly a lead that could pin Michelle as a main suspect in her husband's fatal attack, it was progress nonetheless. Speaking of progress, another tip came in about Marc's attack. According to the anonymous tipster, a man was boasting about attacking Marc. The man in question was Terrence Barker. To add to the suspicion, cell phone records also placed him in the area of the Despain home around the same time Marc was attacked. He was immediately called in for questioning because the investigators now had mountains of evidence against him. According to Terrence, he was given a job to end Marc's life, for which he would receive anywhere between $7,000 to $10,000. When asked about how he got the gig, Terrence said that he was assigned by his pal, Johnny Hubbard, and the detectives soon found out that he was the one driving the blue Mercedes. But who were Terrence and Johnny? They didn't personally know Marc, So why did they commit such a disastrous crime? Well, when the investigators questioned Johnny, he confessed that a man had approached him for a hit on Marc. The man was Carl Kelly, Marc's own father-in-law, the same man who tried to pin Marc's murder on Jack, Marc's father. The police were just as shocked when this twist was revealed. Sure, investigators had their suspicions about Michelle, but Carl was involved too? It was just unbelievable. Johnny went on to say that he, Terrence, and Carl met in a church parking lot to discuss the crime. This detail alone is enough to make anyone sick to their stomach. Like a church is the ideal place to discuss an innocent person's murder. These people have no humanity or conscience. Anyway, it was Johnny who was set to do the job, but he later assigned it to Terrence, and Johnny would be the getaway driver. Carl even went as far as providing the weapon that would be used to attack Marc and ultimately end his life. Johnny and Terrence didn't know Marc. He was a stranger to them, and they agreed to Carl's plan because they wanted to make some extra cash. This information left the detectives baffled. I mean, think about this for a second. This man's life was worth nothing more than $7,000. You can't even buy a decent car for that amount of money these days, but they were willing to kill for it. But detectives still wondered, where did Michelle fall into all of this? Well, Michelle was the brains behind this evil plan. She was the one giving instructions on how to carry out the attack on Marc and make sure that he didn't come out alive. How did the investigators find this out? Well, Michelle's and Carl's phone records detailed how Michelle was giving Carl instructions, and then Carl was relaying all of the information to Johnny and Terrence. So it was clear to the police that Marc's murder was premeditated, but the smoking gun was a text message conversation between Michelle and Carl on the fateful day of August 24th, 2011. Michelle sent a text to Carl at around 8:20 a.m. that read, "Has to be today, can't live like this. It was awful this morning." To this, Carl replied that the job would be done if Michelle could get Marc through lunch. The detectives finally put two and two together. The lunch date between Marc and Michelle was planned all along. This would buy Carl time to get Terrence into the house by using a spare key. It is just so awful to think that Michelle was out with Marc and she knew that this was the last time she would see her husband alive. Michelle knew from the start that Marc wouldn't be alive after that lunch date. If that doesn't send chills down your spine, I don't know what will. Michelle is not only the definition of greedy, but also a cold-blooded killer. The police now knew that they had to have a long chat with Michelle, and she was called in for another round of questions. When the investigators asked Michelle about the affair, she came clean almost immediately. She also confessed that Marc neither knew about the affair nor asked for a divorce. But he did say something. See, Marc was starting to get suspicious of Michelle and sat her down to have a heart-to-heart conversation about the future of their marriage. Marc was considering separation after their children had grown up and moved out of the family home, and Michelle knew that. Even though Marc wasn't about to leave Michelle immediately, he wasn't going to continue living like this. This was completely out of the blue for Michelle. Leaving Marc would mean kissing her very opulent lifestyle goodbye, and she wasn't about to have any of that. The detectives assumed that that was the time when Michelle and Carl joined heads and came up with a very disturbing and evil plan to end Marc's life. They hired Johnny and Terrence to act on the plan. Johnny drove Terrence to Marc's home. Carl let him in, and that was when they all waited. When Marc returned home after lunch with Michelle, he went into the kitchen, and that was when Terrence saw his chance and made the irreversible decision to end Marc's life right then and there, by firing 2 rounds at close range. After the horrible deed was done, Terrence and Johnny fled the scene, and Michelle carried out her best acting skills when she came home under the pretense of fetching the bills and finding her husband's lifeless body in the kitchen. Following the interrogation, even though Michelle was still denying everything and only said that she got to know about her father's involvement after Marc's passing, all 4 suspects were arrested and charged. Terrence Barker and Carl Kelly were charged with first-degree murder, to which they pleaded guilty. Johnny Hubbard and, surprisingly, Marc Despain were charged with hindering apprehension, to which both also pleaded guilty. Michelle was the instigator of Marc's attack, but she wasn't even charged with murder. It's just baffling. Michelle had taken a plea deal and eventually pleaded guilty to 3 counts of hindering the apprehension and prosecution of capital murder, and in turn, She wouldn't have to go through a trial or face a capital murder charge. Michelle was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with a chance of parole after only 5 years. For planning her husband's murder, fueled by greed and cold blood, Michelle could get out in just 5 years. As for the others, Terrence Barker, the man who pulled the trigger, was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Johnny Hubbard was sentenced to 18 years in prison, along with an additional 20 years for violating probation on a previous conviction. Carl Kelly was also sentenced to 35 years in prison. As of 2019, Michelle was out of prison, and now she goes by the name Michelle Coates. She moved to Bryant, Arkansas, married a man named Craig Coates, and is running a nutritional business. She was able to literally just walk away and leave all this behind. Change is inevitable. It can uplift lives or tear them apart. For Marc Despain's parents, Jack and Tana, the change they were thrust into after his untimely death was a living nightmare they never imagined. Every single day, Tana mourns the son she raised with love, her world forever shattered. Marc's love and devotion were met with betrayal from the one person he trusted the most. Michelle, the woman he gave everything to, was nothing more than a greedy serpent hiding behind a mask. Her hunger for more, and more drove her to orchestrate a plan so cold and calculated it ripped apart an entire family. Greed is a slow poison. It consumed Michelle and left the Despain family drowning in heartbreak, a pain they will carry for the rest of their lives. If there's one lesson this story teaches us, it's that no amount of money is worth the destruction of trust, love, and human life. Money can buy comfort, but it should never become the driving force of life. It can open doors, but when it blinds the heart, it leaves only devastation in its wake. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think greed was the only factor at play, or could there be more lurking beneath the surface? Let us know your opinions in the comments below. Your voice matters. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Crimes by Dominic. Your support helps us bring more untold stories to light, and every click brings us one step closer to uncovering the truth. Thank you for watching, and remember, not everything is as it seems.